Let me tell you something that most people don't realize until they're deep into adulthood. The quietest parts of you didn't come from nowhere. The silence you carry, the way your heart races when someone new starts a conversation, that hesitation before you speak, it wasn't random. It was learned, shaped, molded quietly by the people who raised you, often without them ever meaning to. See, nobody becomes an introvert in a vacuum. It's not just a personality trait you're born with. It's also a reflection, a mirror of the emotional weather you grew up in. And if your childhood was filled with storms of criticism, judgment, or even unspoken expectations, it makes perfect sense that you learn to seek shelter in silence. Let's start from the beginning. Think about a child. Open, expressive, curious. They speak freely. They laugh loudly. They move toward the world like it's something waiting to be explored. But then one day, they say something at the dinner table, and everyone laughs. Not with them, but at them. Maybe a parent says, "Stop being dramatic." Music. Maybe a parent says, "Stop being dramatic." It's small, harmless even. But to that child, it plants a seed. Speaking equals danger. Expression equals rejection. And so they adjust. They become careful. They measure their words. They watch instead of speak. That's how it begins. Not as a conscious choice, but as a survival strategy. Because as children, our first priority isn't self-expression, it's belonging. Psychologists call this adaptive inhibition. It means that when your environment doesn't feel emotionally safe, your brain learns to hold back, to suppress, instead of express. It's a form of emotional armor, and it works. You get scolded less. You avoid confrontation. You stay invisible. But over time, that armor becomes your skin. When your parents constantly interrupted you, you learned that your words weren't important. When they compared you to louder, more confident kids, you learned that quietness was a flaw. Music, and when they punished your emotions, told you to stop crying or be strong, you learned that even your inner world wasn't a safe place to share. So you retreated inward. You built a private world where it was safe to think, dream, and feel alone. And years later, you might call that introversion. But deep down it's something else. It's self-protection that got misinterpreted as personality. Let's look at how this happens psychologically. A child's nervous system develops in response to their parents' emotional patterns. If your parents were anxious, unpredictable, or emotionally distant, your body learned to scan for danger, even subtle forms of it. Maybe your father's silence before dinner meant he was angry. Maybe your mother's sigh meant you were about to disappoint her again. Over time, your mind became hyper-aware of emotional cues, reading tone, energy, expression, long before anyone spoke. That's not shyness, that's vigilance. And vigilance creates introversion. It's exhausting to constantly predict emotional weather, so the brain does the only thing it can to manage that stress. It withdraws. It seeks peace through solitude. It finds comfort in predictability. That's why so many introverts say they need alone time to recharge. It's not just about liking solitude. It's that solitude is the only environment where your nervous system can finally relax. But here's the deeper truth. That exhaustion came from years of trying to be emotionally safe in spaces that never truly were. Music, let me give you an example. Imagine you were a sensitive child, the kind who noticed small details, who felt deeply when others were upset. But in your house, that sensitivity was seen as weakness. Maybe you heard, "Stop overreacting," or "You're too sensitive." Over time, that message rewired your brain. Every time you felt something deeply, you questioned yourself. Am I overreacting again? So you suppressed it. Now, fast forward 20 years. You find yourself in a conversation where someone raises their voice slightly and your body immediately shuts down. You don't argue, you don't express, you just freeze or withdraw. That's not just personality, that's conditioning. You were trained quietly and consistently to make yourself small. And ironically, your parents probably didn't mean to do it. They were likely repeating patterns they learned themselves. Maybe your father was raised to believe emotions were weakness. Maybe your mother had to suppress her own voice to survive in her home. Generational silence passed down like an heirloom. And when you think about it that way, you realize introversion isn't a flaw to fix. It's a story to understand. But let's go even deeper, because there's something fascinating about how identity forms in this process. The human brain develops what psychologists call attachment templates. These are unconscious blueprints for how we expect relationships to feel. If you grew up with parents who were emotionally inconsistent, loving one day, distant the next, your brain learned that connection comes with risk. Love feels unpredictable. So, as an adult, you avoid too much closeness because deep down you expect it to vanish. That avoidance can look like independence. It can look like calmness. It can even look like wisdom. But sometimes it's just fear wearing a quiet face. And then people tell you, "You're such a good listener," or "You're so calm and introspective." They mean it as a compliment, and in some ways it is. Your depth, your empathy, your awareness, those are powerful gifts, but they were also built in the shadows of moments when you didn't feel seen. That's the paradox of introversion. It's both a wound and a wisdom. Now, let's talk about how these patterns play out socially. Introverted people often describe feeling drained after socializing. They think it's because they're bad at people. But the truth is, they're often too good at people. They're constantly reading micro-expressions, tone shifts, unspoken meanings. They're running emotional diagnostics in every interaction. That's not socially awkward. That's emotionally intelligent, but it's tiring. You learned that to stay safe, you had to understand everyone around you, their moods, expectations, and emotions, so that you could adjust accordingly. You became an expert, an emotional calibration. That skill kept you safe, but it also made you self-conscious. Every word feels like a calculation. Every silence feels loaded. And so solitude feels like peace, not because you hate people, but because you can finally stop analyzing them. If you ever wonder why you love deep conversations but hate small talk, that's why you crave authenticity. Because growing up, surface-level communication often felt fake or unsafe. You had to read between the lines. So now, anything that feels shallow drains you. But here's what's beautiful about all this. Introversion, though shaped by pain, becomes a lens for depth because you learn to live inside your own head. You also learn to notice things that others miss. The tremble in someone's voice, the meaning behind silence, the poetry hidden in ordinary moments. Your parents may have unintentionally silenced you, but in doing so, they also sharpened your inner world. You became an observer, a thinker, a seeker of truth beyond noise. Still, there's a cost, because while solitude heals, isolation hardens. Many introverts live with an invisible ache, the desire to connect deeply, but the fear that doing so will somehow repeat the pain of childhood. So, they wait for others to reach out first. They test the waters before opening up. They love deeply but quietly, terrified that too much exposure might break the safety they built. And that brings us to an uncomfortable realization. Your parents didn't just shape how you see yourself. They shaped how you see love. If love once felt conditional, if it depended on your behavior, your grades, your silence, then as an adult, love may still feel like something you have to earn by being good, quiet, or low maintenance. That belief runs deep. It hides behind selflessness, behind the phrase, "I don't want to bother anyone." But underneath, it's the same wound. I am easier to love when I take up less space. And yet, your existence has always deserved a space. The moment you understand that, everything changes. Because you begin to realize introversion isn't the problem. The story behind it is you can be quiet without being afraid. You can love solitude without using it as armor. You can be introspective without being invisible. It starts with unlearning the idea that being soft-spoken means being weak, or that being private means being disconnected. Sometimes the quietest people have the loudest inner worlds. They've just never had a safe enough space to share them. And maybe now you can become that safe space for yourself. Think about how long you've been carrying that quietness. Not just as a habit, but as an identity. It became your way of being. You told yourself, "I'm just not a social person." You convinced yourself you prefer silence. But sometimes that silence isn't peace. It's a shield. And the truth is, there's a difference between being at peace and being numb. There's a difference between choosing solitude and being conditioned to fear noise. When you're young, you don't have language for boundaries or emotional neglect. You just feel energy. You notice tension in the room. You feel when love is withdrawn. And so you build invisible strategies. Be quieter, be agreeable, be invisible. You survive. But those survival patterns don't just disappear when you grow up. They become personality traits. You think you're reserved when really you're rehearsed. You think you're private when really you're protecting something fragile. But here's what's incredible. Human beings are not fixed. The brain is constantly rewriting itself through something psychologists call neuroplasticity. That means the same mind that learned to shrink can also learn to expand. You can rewire your sense of safety, not by forcing yourself to be louder, but by teaching your nervous system that expression isn't danger anymore. It starts in small moments, saying what you think without rehearsing it, letting someone interrupt without shrinking, speaking even when your voice trembles. Because every time you do, your body learns a new truth. The world didn't end when I spoke. Healing from this kind of conditioning isn't about becoming an extrovert. It's about reclaiming your right to exist fully, even in quietness. It's realizing that your silence is powerful, but it shouldn't be your prison. Let's look at it from another angle. Imagine your childhood home as a theater. Some kids grew up with spotlights. They were encouraged to perform, to speak, to shine. Others like you grew up backstage watching, observing, studying how the play worked. That gave you insight, empathy, awareness, but it also made you hesitant to step into the light yourself. You learned every cue, every rhythm, every silence. But you forgot that the story doesn't move unless you enter it. And now in adulthood, you might feel like life is happening around you, not with you. You wait to be invited. You wait to be understood. But most people can't see the depth of someone who hides their depth so well. That's why healing starts with a simple but radical act, self-disclosure. Saying out loud, even to yourself, I became this way for a reason. Because once you name it, it's no longer invisible. And once it's visible, you can choose differently. You might notice something else too. Introversion often comes with perfectionism. That's not a coincidence. When your parents made love conditional on performance, on good grades, good manners, good behavior, your mind learned to equate acceptance with perfection. So you became careful with everything, your words, your emotions, your image. You filtered every thought before speaking. You tried to be flawless because mistakes once brought punishment or disapproval. But the cost of perfectionism is authenticity. You end up speaking only when you're sure it's right. You share only when you're certain it won't be rejected. And that's how the cycle of silence keeps repeating long after childhood is over. Yet, here's the paradox. People don't fall in love with perfection. They connect through imperfection. Through the cracks in your voice, through the moments you admit you're scared, through the small confessions that say, "I'm human too." And maybe that's what you've been protecting all along. Not fear, but humanity. Because being an introvert doesn't mean you hate people. It often means you crave connections so real, so undiluted, that ordinary interactions feel empty in comparison. You've never been antisocial. You've been starving for something deeper. Presence, safety, truth. That's why when someone finally listens, really listens, something inside you starts to melt. That's why long late-night conversations feel like medicine. They remind you what you've been missing. A space where silence isn't judged and words aren't used as weapons. And maybe that's what your younger self needed most. Not louder parents, but safer ones. Not more talking, but more listening. It's strange how we inherit emotional languages we never chose. If your parents spoke in criticism, you learn to communicate in self-doubt. If they spoke in silence, you learn to fill that silence with overthinking. And if they spoke in control, you learn to seek freedom through withdrawal. But healing is like learning a new language. One where you don't need to apologize for existing. You start saying things like, "I'm allowed to rest. I'm allowed to speak even if my voice shakes. I'm allowed to be loved without earning it." And slowly the walls you built to protect yourself become doors instead. Still there, but open. You begin to see your parents not as villains, but as mirrors. They too were once children shaped by silence. They too learned that emotions were dangerous. And by understanding that, you stop the inheritance. You stop the echo. Because generational healing doesn't begin with confrontation. It begins with compassion for them and for yourself. You start to realize that your quietness isn't a weakness. It's an evolved form of empathy. You know how to listen because you once needed someone to listen to you. You know how to comfort because you once craved comfort. But don't let that empathy keep you small. Use it, speak with it, write with it, create with it. Because the world doesn't just need louder people. It needs truer ones. And maybe that's what your introversion was always preparing you for. Not isolation, but insight. Not retreat, but reflection. You see the world differently. You feel things deeply. That's not a curse. That's consciousness. Still, there will be days when your mind tells you stay quiet. Don't bother anyone. And on those days, you have to remember that you learned that voice. It's not the truth. It's just an echo. There's a quiet revolution that happens when you stop believing that silence equals safety. Because when you finally start speaking, not from performance, but from authenticity, your presence changes a room. Not because you're loud, but because you're real. And the irony is the same sensitivity that once made you hide, it's the same thing that now allows you to connect with others on a deeper level than most people ever will. That's the full circle of healing. Turning your once defensive silence into intentional stillness. You no longer withdraw out of fear, but because you know that inner peace isn't found in noise. You no longer avoid people, but you choose which energies deserve your attention. You no longer shrink to be loved, but expand carefully, because now you love yourself. When you finally see your introversion not as an accident, but as a story written by years of emotional survival, you also realize something else. You're the author now. You can rewrite it. You can be quiet and courageous, reflective and expressive, gentle and powerful. It's never been about changing who you are. It's about remembering who you were before fear rewrote your personality. Because beneath all the layers of hesitation and carefulness, there's still that same child, curious, open, imaginative, waiting for permission to come out again. And the beautiful thing about adulthood is that now you can give yourself that permission. You can become the parent you needed, patient, understanding, encouraging. So maybe your parents made you an introvert, but you get to decide what that means now. You can let it mean withdrawal, or you can let it mean wisdom. You can let it mean fear of expression, or you can let it mean mastery of thought. The choice is yours, because healing isn't about becoming louder. It's about becoming freer. And when you finally find that freedom, when you speak without fear, love without walls, and rest without guilt, that's when your quiet becomes power. Not the kind that demands attention, but the kind that earns it through presence. Because true peace isn't the absence of noise. It's the confidence to know that even in silence, you still matter.